Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, or should I say, wake up and smell the IT. Well, in the view of today's guest, if businesses want to retain and attract talent, an IT team that ensures a fuss-free digital experience is paramount. And the pandemic-induced increase in home working means that many staff are less concerned about whether their office has a coffee machine and more concerned about whether they can easily use the applications and all that software to do their jobs day in and day out. So Simon Blunn from WalkMe is going to join me today and discuss what digital adoption is. Let's define that and understand what it is and why it's important to businesses and how businesses can achieve true digital adoption. And believe me, there's going to be a few surprises in there. And I think I also want to learn a little bit more about WalkMe's recently released Digital Adoption For Dummies guidebook as well. So much to talk about, so enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the UK so you can join me and Simon in conversation today about digital adoption and the value that it brings to businesses. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little about how you got here and share your origin story with everyone?
Yeah, Neil, thank you for having me first and foremost. So I've spent the last 25 years or so in the technology space. Started my career with HP and Cisco, so two of the kind of leading corporates within the technology sector. But probably over the last decade or so, spent time working for smaller, more rapidly growing organizations, particularly in the data and analytics space. So for the last 10 or 11 years or so, very much in that world of business intelligence, analytics, and the emerging area of AI and machine learning. So certainly an interesting background over the last 20 or so years.
And of course, it was that path that would lead you to WalkMe. And we have had Dan Adika on the podcast before. We were talking about just a few moments ago before we started recording. But for anyone that's missed our previous conversation and hearing about WalkMe for the first time, can you just tell the listeners a little about the kind of problems that you're helping your customers solve?
Absolutely. So, when WalkMe approached me, I found it a very interesting discussion. And the reasons for that are, I think the underlying challenges that we're addressing as a technology company are things that we can all see in our day-to-day lives. So fundamentally, we're about helping people utilize technology in a more effective way. I often use myself as a key example of that. In order to run the business that I'm doing across EMEA, I probably use 10 to 12 software applications a day, whether that's an HR platform, whether that's a CRM platform, or many other technologies to do my job. But WalkMe can sit on top of those technologies and make my user experience that much more enhanced. So therefore, I don't need to be an expert in a CRM system or in an ERP system or in an HR system. And by my own definition, I wouldn't describe myself as an expert in those types of technologies, but I need to be able to use them effectively to be productive and do my job. And fundamentally, that is the whole premise of what WalkMe is all about.
And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today was to talk about the importance of digital adoption. But just to set the scene, can you maybe define it and also explain why it's so important to businesses?
Sure. And I think that the challenge is an underlying one where technology for so many years, and as I said, I've been here for a few decades at least, but if I just look at the last decade, the amount of technology now has moved to the cloud. So in theory, far easier to use, easier to get access to. But on the whole, organizations are still not getting a great return on those technology investments, either through not a lot of people actually using the technology that they're given as a user, or they struggle to actually use the capabilities of that technology. I'll give you an easy example. When I joined WalkMe 18 months ago, I joined in the height of the UK pandemic and the lockdown process. So I joined a company when I got sent a MacBook through the post and said, right, okay, here's what we do within the world of WalkMe. These are the applications. You need to get on and use them. The advantage we had is we have WalkMe sitting on top of our own technologies to be able to make my job easier. I didn't have corporate IT around the corner for me to go and talk to and say, look, I need some help using Salesforce or using Workday or any other application like that. I had to get on and do it because I couldn't even access an office. So I think that's the underlying type of challenge that businesses have. People and the new generation that we have within organizations now have no appetite to sit in a classroom, for example, and use a technology or learn a technology like we used to do 5-10 years ago. People want to have instant access to technology. We're all coming from an iPhone generation where if it doesn't work quickly and it's not easy to use, we pretty much won't use those technologies. And that's okay if you're an individual using an iPhone because you have the choice to what type of applications you want to download. But if that's a corporate environment and a company is invested in a technology that is the platform they need everyone to use, and 50% of users switch off and say, well, I don't really fancy using that, that is not a good investment. And therefore, companies definitely need help. And when I looked at this space and understood more about it, nearly every company has got this challenge right now. That's not to say that everyone's trying to solve it. Some feel they're not mature enough yet to be able to solve that problem. But the underlying problem we are trying to solve is something that pretty much every organization is battling with to a certain extent.
And I suspect we've got people listening all over the world, and I suspect that your words will resonate with each and every person, no matter what their background is, what their position is, because that is the state of the world right now. And I think everyone's kind of been through that experience that you have. So I suppose the big question really is how can businesses achieve true digital adoption like that, and which ultimately is secret to retaining staff too, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. I think the whole last couple of years in both the pandemic and the way that the markets have changed, I think people have got an option now to choose their career path, choose the companies they work for. It's been a very buoyant market, even though even recently things have slightly changed with the way that the markets have operated. However, that means that companies have to deliver value to their employees, and adding digital skill sets and digital adoption as part of their evolution of skills is an important part in any industry now. What we're finding is, as a technology that can address multiple industries, there is these pain points appearing in all of these different types of industry sectors, some moving faster than others, but it's certainly something that companies are having to address, and they want to provide added value to their user community of the technology that they're putting across to them. So it's certainly something that I think both employees are demanding and employees are recognizing that they have to deliver in order to both sustain their competitive advantage, but also attract talent in the market. And it's certainly been a difficult market for talent, and it will continue to do that with the whole, I'm sure you've had it on your own podcast with, the whole great resignation conversation. People have a lot of choice, and that certainly applies to the world of technology, and that's ultimately what we're trying to address.
And I think just over 2 years ago, just about every business was forced to just get out there, replace those legacy clunky technologies with swanky new software solutions. But there is an argument that in many cases it can actually make things worse or even more confusing for businesses and their staff, and actually worsening that digital experience and end up driving down productivity instead of increasing it. Is this a challenge you've seen too, and how are you helping overcome challenges like this?
It's certainly a great point, Neil. And I think the pandemic itself drove a lot of people to think, right, we've got to go and buy new technologies. We've got to do things in a different way to support people working from home when they may have never done that before. Yeah. The reality is the answer isn't always go and buy the latest shiny technology out there. If you have an HR system, it may not be perfect, but buying another one doesn't automatically solve your problem. It's how people are using that technology. So we often see people kind of addressing that first mover advantage of saying, well, we've got to have the latest and greatest all the time. But if people aren't going to adopt it, it doesn't matter what you deliver, whether it's a legacy application or the most modern one out there in the market. If people aren't engaging, don't understand how to use it, or you're not helping them use it, then you're still going to get low adoption. And that's something I think is finally starting to be seen in the market. And we see with our own work with some of the market analysts out there that they're now defining this as a formal category in its own right. Digital adoption and digital adoption technologies like WalkMe, which is described as a platform, so adapt platform, they are saying this is a real need for organizations out there in a market. And for us, it's about helping you use the technology you've got today. That still may highlight that you need a new technology in a particular part of your business, but we can help you deploy that from the outset, so that if you think of the traditional way of people rolling out technologies, certainly in larger organizations, is you roll it out, you hope people will adopt it. You typically go through a curve of early adoption and then it drops off because people find it complex or they struggle to deal with it. That's what traditionally people then came to WalkMe and said, well, how can we solve an application that we've already rolled out and get users to adopt it more effectively? That's a typical use case we see often. What our advanced customer base now and even newer organizations who are approaching us saying, we're about to go and roll out a new technology. And therefore, how do we deploy that in an effective way using WalkMe as well to make sure that the deployment of that from the outset is a huge success? And I think that's a much more proactive way of looking at it than typically a reactive of we've done something not so well or it hasn't been a success. How do we go and fix it? So I think as this space is maturing, people's approach and proactive nature is maturing at the same side of things as well. So I think there is definitely a shift in how we're seeing technologies like WalkMe being deployed in organizations.
Yeah, 100% with you there. And you also said a few moments ago about digital adoption and also the importance it has on retaining talent and attracting talent, especially in the world of the Great Resignation. But I'm curious, have you seen any direct impacts of how digital adoption around businesses wanting to retain and attract talent? Is that something that you're seeing more and more at the moment?
Absolutely, and I think that's even just reflected in a great platform like LinkedIn, where there's currently, I think, about 4,000 active open opportunities, advertised on LinkedIn for digital adoption, skill and experience people, and roles that help companies do this. Even if you wound the clock back 18 months, 2 years, that was never the case. It wasn't even a category in its own right. So I think the evolution of the market is driving this, that people are moving from just chief digital officer to actually digital adoption type roles appearing in large organizations as part of the IT organization or as part of the business landscape. So it's certainly maturing on that side of things. And companies that are using these types of technologies successfully, I think those employees are both demanding more from those companies going forward when it comes to new technologies that they have access to, but also as naturally people move around, people are demanding that. If you've had an environment where you had help using technology with a platform like WalkMe or others, and you go to one that isn't, then people are very vocal around that. So I think that's helping the evolution of this market. I often talk to people around, if you look at any sort of technology space, you can look at it in a kind of typical 5-year kind of life cycle. Not everything perfectly maps onto a 5-year life cycle. But if you think it, at a macro level, I still think we're in year one, maybe just tipping into year two of that typical kind of life cycle. So there's huge growth area for this development of this market further, because as I said, I believe nearly every company has this challenge to a certain extent. It's about, how willing are you to address it, both from a technology point of view and in the maturity of what you're trying to deliver for your employee base.
And I appreciate this is a pretty big question, but is there any advice or specific tips that you would offer for a business leader that just wants to offer their staff those hassle-free digital experiences and help them achieve their true digital adoption as a result? Is there any secrets there or any advice that you can pass on?
I think it's about thinking at it from a user perspective rather than just, we're buying into these technologies for this sake. How is it from a user experience? And I think the benefit of when we talk around this subject with anyone in an organization, whether that's a CRO looking at a CRM platform or a chief HR officer looking at their HR platform for all of their employees, every single one of those people is a user in their own right. So we're all sitting here doing whatever role we have within our organization, utilizing technology. So I think everyone has the ability to be able to relate to this challenge. I wouldn't say that, therefore the principle of it is somewhat simple to understand. the way you solve it and the technology that we have and underpins this is complex to do this type of thing and make it easier for a user to utilize this type of technology. However, the principle of the challenge we're trying to address, I think, is simple. What we are trying to do is help educate the market, because we still have to evangelize to a certain extent. We're doing this with what we've just done with Digital Adoption For Dummies, which a lot of technology vendors do as well, to help educate people that go, do you know what, I'm sure I do need this help, or as a business leader, I need to be able to focus on this in our organization, but how do I do it? So we've just recently published that as a bit of content, which I think people can download from our website. And I think it's a great starter. And obviously talking to us as a company can help you navigate, where are people in our kind of typical life cycle. And we're very happy to talk to prospective clients around that in terms of how they can evolve in this digital adoption space.
And as someone that works right in the heart of this space, I suspect that you are monitoring a lot of trends very closely. So are there any key trends in digital adoption and enterprise IT more broadly that you're noticing or maybe excite you at the moment?
Well, I think the adoption of cloud, which continues to go at an incredible pace. When you look at all of those key cloud providers out there, in terms of the underlying cloud platforms, their growth is phenomenal. And I think that now has become truly mainstream, whereas typically nearly every leading software vendor out there is deploying a cloud version of their technology. And organizations themselves are building the private clouds or utilizing the public cloud in a very effective way. For us to be able to deliver the WalkMe solution and the platform to the market, that's based around cloud technology or technology that comes through a browser. So that still can be a non-cloud environment, but it can be a web interface into that. Those are the enablers that have enabled the kind of DAP platform like WalkMe to become effective, because it's based on that. It's interacting with you as the user and actually not having to integrate with the underlying platform. So it's far easier to deploy, and therefore we're just utilizing the interface between the user and the system, not the system itself. So we can sit on pretty much any technology that's out there. We don't have to go and integrate with a whole raft of different software vendors. So I think that's the evolution probably in the last 3 to 4 years, where cloud acceleration has become very, very strong and mainstream, that has really advanced this space, because this technology challenge has been around for probably, the last 25 years since I've been in technology. But the technology enablers have not been there because people had internal legacy systems that didn't have access, through cloud browsers, etc. So the way of solving this problem is what WalkMe does, wasn't able to be done. The cloud has enabled that to be the case. And I only see that going in one way, not going back the other way. So I think it will only enhance further as pretty much everyone has either 100% full stack cloud or gets further to that point going forward.
And this space is incredibly overwhelming and daunting to a lot of businesses of all sizes, really. And another reason I was excited to get you on today was I also read about WalkMe's recently released Digital Adoption For Dummies guidebook. Can you expand on that and tell me a little bit about the story behind that book too?
Yes. So just as I kind of touched on briefly, we earlier, we have released this just to help people understand the space. Just the conversation we're having today kind of highlights that a lot of people still aren't aware of it. It's a new phase of technology that's coming along. So we use that as one element of content that people can download, read, and look at it in the context of what does the whole digital adoption space look like? What does it mean? And therefore, if you apply that into your own business or into your own role, how can you either enhance your skills around this or think about it in terms of your business? So I've used many of those guides for other technologies in my past as both a user and someone in different sectors of the technology space. And I think it's a very good guide. They've got a great brand out there in the market and people like to use them. So we've done that. There's also a lot of content around industries and different personas that we have on our own website, walkme.com, which I would also encourage people listening to maybe have a look at that. But the Dummies Guide particularly is a great starting point around, if you want to understand what digital adoption is, it's a great starting point.
Well, we started the podcast today talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. And before you leave us, I'd just like you to leave everyone listening with a personal note of inspiration, whether that be a song for our Spotify playlist, a book for our Amazon wishlist, or a podcast, or anything at all that has inspired you over the last few years or in your career. Is there anything you'd leave everyone listening with?
Well, there's probably two elements which I would add. So if I may, I'll kind of expand on the one option. Certainly book-wise. Book I would recommend to listeners is Hard Things About Hard Things from Ben Horowitz. It's a book that's been out probably 5-6 years, and it's a bit of a kind of business Bible that I use around when you're in kind of these hyper-growth startup organizations, navigating the complexities of that, which I think can be applied to many different businesses. And I think it's a brilliant read, and therefore would certainly recommend that one. On a more personal basis, I love podcasts myself. One I listened to just last week was the podcast with the CEO of Brewdog, James Watt, which I think has got a fascinating story of building out that company. And then there's a lot of similarities to a tech startup, really, even though they're a brewery company. I think he took a kind of technology sector approach to being disruptive in a very traditional kind of drinks market. And I think his own story and the evolution of that company, I think is a fascinating listen. So that's out there as well. And it was a great kind of hour of my time last week listening to that story. So those are two areas, a book and a podcast, that I would highly recommend.
Awesome. Well, I'll get the book added to our Amazon wish list. I'll be checking out that podcast episode too. And if anyone listening checks it out, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But more than anything, just a big thank you for joining me today, Simon. And before I let you go, for anyone listening wanting to find out more information, maybe check out that guidebook or just contact your team if they've got any questions. What's the best starting point for everything?
Absolutely. So the guide is out there now. They can download that from WalkMe.com, and certainly any sort of reference point or interaction you'd like with WalkMe, then the website again is, there's an opportunity to ask for a demo or interaction. So if you put your details in, the WalkMe team will certainly reach out to you directly.
Well, as I said at the very beginning of the podcast, I think this space is very daunting and overwhelming for businesses, especially as they're navigating these uncharted digital waters. And I just cannot thank you enough for coming on and just offering some refreshingly clear, practical advice for business leaders and anyone wanting to offer their staff hassle-free digital experiences and help them achieve true digital adoption as a result. And also for revealing some of those key trends in digital adoption and enterprise IT more broadly. But just thank you for sharing all that and spending a little time and sharing your story with me today.
My pleasure, Neil. Thank you very much for having me.
A big thank you to Simon for coming on here today and talking about the centrality of digital adoption. And although digital transformation is essential to businesses in every single industry, the technologies embraced during these business digital transformations might be used and understood, but it isn't always the case. And replacing legacy technologies with some new shiny solution could run the risk of making things more confusing for staff, worsening their digital experience and drive down productivity if that time is not spent with them to get everybody on the same page. Ultimately, digital adoption is central to a successful digital transformation. But that's just my thoughts. You've heard from me today. You've heard from today's guest. I want to hear what you think. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram @NeilCHughes, and my website if you'd like to work with me or browse through over 2,000 other interviews. Simply drop by my site, techblogwriter.co.uk. But I've taken up far too much of your time already today, so thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.